This recording will cover part 2 of chapter 4 from your textbook. So, some social emotional difficulties that are prevalent during adolescence, and who knows, you may or may not end up working with students of this age, but I like to prepare you just in case. Some students might be socially alienated, they might feel lonely. So, there's some ways that you can help them. You can provide small group and collaborative work. It encourages all students to participate. Establish a tone of valuing each individual, interact with them. Again, greet them at the door, especially middle school students, right? There's a lot of class changing happening. So greet them at the door, say hello, and make them feel welcome. Involve them in decision making and provide activities which they engage in with their peers. Okay, suicide, unfortunately, I hate that we have to talk about this for any age, but for school age children especially, but you all know, these kids go through a lot. They have to deal with a lot. Some students are depressed, there's substance abuse, family history of suicide, family violence, firearms, incarceration, any of these things, that our poor kiddos have to go through now. So, you want to take all suicide attempts seriously, develop communication with the person, a rapport with them, reestablish emotional support. I'm here for you. I'm here to support you and help you and work with the adolescent to identify problems. If the student is suicidal, don't leave them alone. Get them to seek immediate help and eliminate access to harmful items. And again, it's unfortunate that we have to talk about this. Um, some social emotional interventions, that you can use to develop the ability or to show your students how to adapt to social situations and regulate their emotions. You could teach them how to, solve problems, make decisions quickly, right? Don't sit there and say, let's talk about this for 27 minutes and then we'll keep going back and forth and back and forth. No, make a decision, solve the problem. Adapt to situations, you might have to teach them how to do some of these things, especially your students who are officially identified with emotional or behavioral learning or emotional or behavioral disabilities, excuse me. Communicate effectively with others. All these things are going to need some explicit instruction. Making and maintaining friends, reducing anxiety, reducing problem behaviors, and showing those desired behaviors, right? We've talked about that. And then also there's one strategy in your book that I really like, and this is the FAST strategy. And this is considered an evidence-based practice. For your assignments, you will look where it says instructional activities, but I'm going to use FAST. I'm going to use this as my example for all of you when I do an example, a sample of what I'm looking for those instructional activities. Okay, but just FYI, FAST stands for, of course, there's more letters, people. Hello. Okay, so it's an interpersonal problem solving strategy. F, freeze and think. What is the problem? A, alternatives. What are my possible solutions? S, solution evaluation. Choose the best solution. Is this safe and is it fair? T, try it slowly and carefully. Does it work? So that is the FAST strategy. Again, I will do a more thorough demonstration of this FAST strategy when I do the video for your instructional activities, which, by the way, while I'm in the textbook, chapter 4 does start with the instructional activities. So this is what it looks like. It'll say instructional activities in your textbook, okay? And so there's all sorts of activities underneath where it says instructional activities. So chapter 4, it happens to start on page 111, and I'm just showing you all this because I was here. So here are the instructional activities, objectives, grades, materials, teaching procedures. Some of them are longer than others, which is why I will give you an example of what I'm looking for, okay? So chapter 4 has some good ideas, so if you have some students who are struggling with some emotional behavioral things, there are some activities here in chapter 4. Right, so let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so, all right, so I talked to you all about FAST. Sorry, I keep trying to move the little box. Okay, then some interpersonal problem solving. There are some skills or some instructional activities for that in the textbook as well. 4 skills important for successful problem resolution: identify and define the problem, again, specifically, not just in broad terms, generate alternative solutions, evaluate possible consequences of each, and implement solution and determine the effect. So kind of like FAST, right? Like we just talked about. Here's some problem solving steps to teach. And again, explicitly teach these steps. Don't just assume that students know how to solve their own problems, because they don't, especially when they're younger. That's what you're there for. Okay, some principles for teaching social and emotional skills: develop cooperative learning, where we focus on working together and not against each other, right? Try to use cooperative learning, small groups, stuff like that. Opportunities for working with peers in supportive and academically structured activities, not just play, but also some of those academically structured activities. Principles of effective instruction, right? Model, rehearse, role play, provide feedback, other effective strategies. All of those things can be used to teach, explicitly teach social emotional skills. Again, don't just assume that your students are going to come to you knowing how to behave and how to have all these appropriate social skills. Teach for transfer of learning to other settings, generalization, stuff like that. Empower students, give them choices, but let them know here are the consequences. And again, consequences are not always bad, right? And then identify the strengths of your students. So going back to, what can you do? Well, how can you prepare the instructional environment? How can you manipulate those antecedents to provide a pleasant and environment, that is conducive to learning? Because that's really what we want, right? We want everyone to be pleasant and learn. So some instructional arrangements that you can think of, and you can use, all of these, or four out of the 6 of these in the same lesson, right? If you're teaching math, you can start with large group explicit instruction, modeling, guided practice, stuff like that. You can move into some small group instruction. Maybe some of your students might need a little more one-on-one. So while everyone else is working through math centers or working on this, oh, maybe you go help, little back to Mrs. Stapler. We're going to go help her. She needs some help. Some independent practice activities, cooperative learning, again, collaborative skills, and peer teaching and class-wide peer tutoring. There's one particular program is called PALS, Peer Assisted Learning Strategies, that I used a lot when I taught children with learning disabilities. I don't think I used it with children with autism. And we will talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of weeks. So instruction materials and equipment, you want to think about the effectiveness, the academic level of the instructional materials, equipment that you're providing for them. Of course, there are published materials out there that you can use. Just make sure you find some high quality, research-based ones. Instructional equipment, do you have headphones, projectors, smartboards, what do you have? And all this falls under preparing the instructional environment. I know the heading is kind of weird. Developing instructional materials, you might need to make some games. And I think on page, I think it's 107 in the textbook, there's an example of just kind of a generic game, a board game that you could use. Sentence strips. I have sentence strips in my office currently, and I use them when I teach face-to-face. And organizing and managing materials for easy access. How are you going to organize the materials so that your students know how to organize the materials? Okay, and also we can think about scheduling within the classroom. Yes, there are some things that you can't control, but you can think about things like communication. This is assuming you're a special ed teacher, by the way, this particular slide. You can communicate with the gen ed classroom teachers, plan co-teaching, meet with specialists. Your textbook also gives an example of a co-teaching schedule. You can observe students with special needs in, and I assume they kind of mean gen ed classrooms. If you're the special ed teacher, maybe you could go in to the regular ed, the gen ed, classroom, and provide some observations and some ideas. Oh, hey, maybe you could try an advanced organizer for this student. Feedback, stuff like that. Explicit instruction for students with disabilities, that modeling, guided practice, independent practice, that really explicit instruction. Don't just assume students with disabilities are going to pick up on things. We need to be explicit with them, both behaviorally and academically. Okay, alternate preferred and less preferred activities. Oh, if you do this thing that you like, then we'll do this that you don't like, but then you get to do this that you do like. Again, something like that. Be consistent in scheduling, right? So have a schedule, have a routine. but also be flexible because we all know schools are not always, they don't always work on your schedule. Sometimes there's a fire drill. Sometimes there's the power goes out. Sometimes this happens. So you do have to be ready to change, but also have a schedule and try to follow it as consistently as you can. And then meet with each student and members of each student's families, get to know them and establish that relationship with them. All right, and then developing an overall schedule for a resource consultant program. So if you're a resource teacher, you're going to need to think about scheduling for providing direct instruction to the students. And this is kind of thinking of you're a resource teacher and you're pulling students out of gen ed to your resource classroom. But you'll have to work with the classroom teachers so that you can provide direct instruction to those students, pulling them out. But what are they going to be missing, right? You also might provide some indirect instruction by consulting with the gen ed teachers, the families, stuff like that. Assessing current referred students, serving as an instructional resource, yep, for other teachers. I used to have teachers, I know back when I was teaching, we were supposed to have our doors locked at all times. However, I was a resource teacher, so that was very problematic because not only did I have kids coming and going all day long, I also had other teachers, and they would come in and they would say, "Oh, I'm really struggling with Susie Highlighter over here. She's not getting this. Do you have any resources? Do you have any ideas? Do you have any suggestions?" Sure, I do. Let me tell you what I have here. Have you tried this? Have you tried this? So don't tell my old district, but I always used to keep my door unlocked. Shh, don't tell. So you want to think about also how you can plan, co-teach, and modify instructional materials, working as a special ed teacher and the gen ed teacher working together, and then facilitating the implementation of our favorite RTI and how that is going to look, those different tiers. Okay, and then the last thing, special considerations for scheduling in secondary settings. Again, you may or may not end up in a secondary setting, I get you, but it's in the book, so I'm just going to share it. It's typically less flexible. Secondary, there's a lot going on, right? There's a lot of instructional periods, curricular units, they must complete for high school graduation. When you're K-5, you're not graduating per se, right? You don't have to have all of the credits and everything that you need from high school. So high school is not my area. I am an early childhood elementary person, and this is partly why. Determine the subject areas in which students might need special classes, areas in which they succeed in gen ed, potentially with support, right? They might need some special ed support, but maybe they can stay in the gen ed classrooms. And sometimes your role is a learning and behavioral specialist, where you could consult, again, if you're kind of a special ed teacher, not those of you going on to be gen ed teachers, you could consult with content area teachers, doing some co-teaching, progress monitoring, and use of data, if those students need to move from tier 1 to tier 2 and then ultimately tier 3. That could be one of your roles if you end up in a secondary setting. All right, I think that is it for the textbook. It is. Let me just show you really quickly because I have 2 seconds. Let me show you a couple other things in the textbook. And I know it's so annoying I have to go page by page, but I wanted to show you, and I will move the little box in a second. Okay, so on page 107, here is that generic board game that I was talking about. So you could really adapt this to anything, to content areas, anything. You could use file folders to make the board game, to use as your game board, I guess, and whatever you have could be little markers and stuff like that. Okay, so that's one thing. That's just a generic board game. And then also pages 108 through 110 have some more suggestions. Down here, here's a schedule for 4th through 6th grade students, kind of a resource schedule, just in case you end up in that situation. This might be something that could be helpful for you. Here's another schedule. This is a sample schedule for intermediate level special ed program. So kind of, that middle school age group before we get to the dreaded high school. And then on page 110, here is a sample co-teaching schedule. So, just some things to give you some ideas depending on where you end up. All right, so that is it for chapter 4, and I will see you back for chapter 5.